The silence was the first lie. The morning of September 8th dawned clear and oddly quiet over the northern districts. The constant thunder of artillery that had rattled windows for weeks had shifted, grown distant. Some residents dared to hope. Perhaps the front had stabilized. Perhaps the worst was over. Anna Ivanova, a schoolteacher living in the Vyborg district, noted in her diary that she planned to queue for bread early, then see if she could find fresh cabbage at the market. The autumn sun felt warm. Children, who had been kept indoors for days, were let out to play in the courtyards of the massive, solid apartment blocks. Life, though frayed by war, persisted in its mundane rhythms. People went to work at the factories that still functioned. They tended their small garden plots. They traded rumors at the water pump. The idea of a siege was a medieval concept, something from history books about Troy or Jerusalem. It did not belong to the modern, industrial 20th century. Not here. Not to them. Leningrad was a city of imperial grandeur and revolutionary fit. Its wide boulevards, baroque palaces, and sweeping river vistas spoke of its purpose. A window to the west, a symbol of Peter the Great's ambition. But beneath the gilt and granite, it was a working city. The Kirov plant built tanks. The Electrosila factory produced turbines. Its sprawling port was a hub of commerce and naval power. The 3 million people within its boundaries were factory workers, engineers, artists, scientists, students, and clerks. They lived in communal apartments, sharing kitchens and bathrooms, their lives woven into a tight, often contentious, urban fabric. They were proud of their city's resilience during the revolution and its cultural might. They believed in its inherent strength. This belief was the bedrock beneath their feet. The war was far away, then closer, then at the gates, but the bedrock held, until the geography itself turned against them. The pressure built not with a scream, but with a whisper of absence. It was the empty space on a tramcar where a familiar face should have been. It was the growing list of temporarily unavailable items at the gastronom. Sugar vanished first, then canned meat, then soap. The queues, always a feature of Soviet life, transformed. They grew longer, quieter, more desperate. People stood for hours, their eyes fixed on the shop door, their bodies calculating the diminishing returns of effort versus calories burned. The first air raid sirens of the blockade, were treated with serious attention. People filed diligently into shelters, but as the days passed and the German bombers methodically targeted warehouses, flour mills, and power stations, a grim calculus set in. Was the risk of a bomb worth losing your place in the breadline? For many, the answer was no. They would stand in the open street, listening to the drone of engines, watching the puffs of anti-aircraft fire and pray the line moved faster. The breaking point was not a single moment, but the slow, dawning realization that the numbers no longer lied. City authorities, led by the grim Andrei Zhdanov, knew the truth earlier than most. A secret report calculated the city's food reserves. Flour for 35 days, grain and cereals for 30, meat for 33. That was for a peacetime population, with the front devouring supplies and refugees swelling the city. The reality was far worse. Ration cards were introduced, with categories based on your contribution to the war effort. A factory worker got 600 grams of bread per day. A clerk or child got 400. The bread itself began to change. It grew darker, denser, as barley oats, cottonseed cake, and cellulose were mixed into the flour. It smelled of earth and sawdust. The official announcements crackled over loudspeakers, urging calm, promising supply convoys, speaking of heroic resistance. But the truth was in the shrinking loaf, in the cold that arrived early in October, seeping into unheated apartments, and in the eyes of your neighbor, which had begun to hold a new, feral kind of assessment. For Olga Nikolaevna, a widow who worked as a bookkeeper, the breaking point came on a Tuesday. She had stood in line since before dawn, her card clutched in numb fingers. When she finally reached the counter, the clerk, a pale woman with hollow cheeks, sliced her daily ration. It was a piece smaller than 2 matchboxes laid side by side. Olga looked at it, then at the clerk. No words were exchanged. The clerk's gaze was empty, a window into a room stripped bare of compassion. In that silent exchange, Olga understood. The system, the state, The community, it could no longer protect her. Survival was now a personal equation. She walked home, not feeling the icy rain. She placed the bread on the table, sat down, and for the first time, considered the unthinkable. How long could she live on this? What would she do when it was not enough? The trap was no longer just outside the city. It was inside her kitchen. The struggle was measured in grams and degrees. November 1941 arrived like a predator. Temperatures plunged to -30°C. The water pipes froze and burst. No electricity meant no lights, no trams, no radio except for battery-powered units broadcasting coded metronome beats to prove the city still lived. People melted snow for water. They burned books, furniture, floorboards for heat. The once grand city became a landscape of ice and silence, broken by the distant thump of shells in the closer, more terrible sound of a wooden sled dragging down the street. You didn't look to see what was on it. You knew. The human body began to consume itself. The medical name was dystrophy. On the streets, it was kajade. The hunger. People swelled with edema, their skin growing taut and shiny. Their hair fell out. They moved with a slow, shuffling gait, conserving every ounce of energy. Mental fog descended. A professor might forget his own address. A mother might stare at her crying child, unable to comprehend the sound. Yet, within this collapsing world, humanity forged terrible innovations. People became alchemists of scarcity. They made blockade jelly from carpenter's glue, skimming the gelatin from boiled wood glue and flavoring it with bay leaves. They ground sheep gut into a foul-tasting paste. They scavenged for weed seeds, pine needles, anything with potential calories. The city's famous botanical garden saw its priceless collection of exotic plants quietly disappear into cooking pots. Social bonds stretched to the snapping point. There were heroes, doctors working until they dropped in overcrowded hospitals, scientists who protected the seed bank, choosing to starve rather than eat the future's wheat. There was also the darkness. The black market flourished. A loaf of real bread could cost a family silver heirlooms or a woman's virtue. Reports of cannibalism, rare but verified, began to circulate. A secret horror whispered in the frozen dark. The pressure did not create monsters or saints. It revealed the raw spectrum of human endurance. The ice road over Lake Ladoga, the road of life, was a thread of hope spun from desperation. In late November, as the ice thickened just enough to bear weight, the first horse-drawn carts ventured onto the vast, wind-scoured lake. It was a gauntlet of nature and war. German planes strafed the convoys. Trucks and horses broke through thin ice and vanished into the black water. Drivers, half-frozen and starving, made the run, bringing in sacks of flour and cans of condensed milk, taking out refugees, mostly women and children. The math was brutal. For every ton of food that arrived, men died. For every evacuee who reached the far shore, a driver did not return. The road was not a solution. It was a transfusion, just enough to keep the city's heart beating faintly, preventing total extinction but not the daily dying. Inside the city, the sound of a shell was almost welcome. It meant you were still a target, still alive. The silence of starvation was worse. The aftermath began not with liberation, which would not come for 872 days, but with the spring thaw of 1942, the snow melted, revealing what the winter had hidden. Corpses lay in the streets, in courtyards, in abandoned trams. Over 600,000 people had died in that first, horrific winter. The survivors emerged from their apartments like ghosts, blinking in the sunlight, their bodies broken but their will, inexplicably, not entirely extinguished. A new, different struggle began. Cleaning the city, planting vegetable gardens in every square inch of soil, fighting the epidemics that followed famine. The siege was not over. The shelling and bombing continued, but the absolute edge of mass starvation had been blunted. The city, in its grotesque way, adapted. Small factories reopened. A symphony orchestra, its musicians barely able to hold their instruments, performed Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony, a defiant roar of art against the darkness. The legacy of the trap is etched in memory and stone. The Piskaryovskoy Memorial Cemetery holds over 500,000 victims in mass graves. The siege became the central, defining trauma of the city, a scar deeper than any revolution or war. It proved that in the modern age, a city could be besieged not by walls, but by maps and mathematics. It demonstrated the limits of human physiology and the shocking depths of human resilience. The decisions made there by leaders who hid the truth, by individuals who shared their last crust or stole their neighbors' rations, by drivers who crossed the lethal ice were. All decisions under a pressure so immense, it distorted morality itself. The Leningrad trap asked the ultimate question. What are you when everything that sustains you is gone? The answer was not uniform. It was a mosaic of courage, desperation, love, and collapse. The 3 million who entered the trap were forever changed. Those who survived carried the cold of that winter inside them for the rest of their days. A chilling reminder that civilization is thin, that hope is a currency that can deplete, and that sometimes the only way out is through a hell of your own enduring. The spring of 1942 did not bring freedom. It brought mud, the stench of decay, and a grim, new clarity. The trap was permanent. The German ring held fast, but the nature of the pressure shifted. The immediate, shocking fist of mass starvation had clenched and relaxed slightly with the trickle of supplies over Lake Ladoga. Now, a slower, more complex siege of attrition began. Survival was no longer just about enduring the next empty day. It was about rebuilding a shred of normalcy on a foundation of bones. City authorities, faced with the skeletal remnants of a 1,000,000-strong workforce, made a brutal calculation. The most vital, industry's arms, munitions, ship repair had to restart, not for some distant victory, but for the city's very identity. To work was to defy. To produce a shell was to say, we are not just dying. We are still fighting. Maria Fyodorovna, who had buried her husband and youngest son in January, returned to the Kirov plant in April. She was a ghost of her former self, her assembler's hands now trembling and weak. The factory was a shell of iron and broken windows, partially heated by makeshift wood stoves. The work quota was a cruel joke. But she went. Every morning, she walked the 3 kilometers on legs that felt like straw. She did it because the 700 grams of bread for an essential worker meant her surviving teenage son, Pavel, could have half. She did it because the rhythmic clang of metal, antagonists, the shared focus on a tangible task, walled off the memories of the winter for 8 hours a day. The work was excruciating. Women and teenagers lifted heavy components, fainted at their stations, were carried out, and often returned the next day. The tanks they built were driven directly from the assembly line, through the ruined streets, to the front line just kilometers away. The war machine was being fed by the very people it had failed to protect. The irony was not lost on them. It was simply irrelevant. Presser forged a terrible pragmatism. The city underwent a grotesque metamorphosis. The grand parks and boulevards, the summer garden, the field of Mars, were plowed into vast vegetable plots. Every square meter of soil became a battlefield. People planted potatoes, cabbage, beets, anything that could grow in the short northern summer. They fertilized the soil with soot and human waste. This was not hobby farming. It was a collective lifeline. University agronomists gave radio lectures on maximizing yield from tiny plots. Children stood guard against thieves. The green shoots pushing through the bomb-scarred earth became a psychological lifeline, as potent as any bread ration. They represented a future, a next season. Meanwhile, the authorities organized sanitary days. With the thaw revealing the horror, teams of citizens, themselves barely alive, were tasked with clearing the corpses from streets and courtyards. It was a public health necessity, draped in a thin veil of ceremony. The dead were loaded onto lorries, not individually, but in piles. There were no coffins. There was no fuel for crematoria. The majority were taken to Piskaryovka and other vacant lands on the city's edge, tipped into long, open trenches. The living walked past this process, their faces blank. The emotional capacity for horror had been spent. This was just another chore of the siege, the final logistics of the trap. The human mind, under unrelenting pressure, did not just break. It sometimes bent into strange, new shapes. Scientists at the All-Union Institute of Plant Industry, housed in a freezing building, protected a priceless collection of seeds over 200,000 varieties of grains, potatoes, and legumes from around the world. As the hunger reached its peak, the staff, several of whom were renowned botanists, made a conscious choice. They barricaded the seed vaults. They took turns guarding them, and they starved to death. Surrounded by edible seeds that represented the future of global agriculture. Not a single sack was pillaged. In a different district, a group of artists, too weak for physical labor, began to document the siege. They drew the queues, the empty streets, the faces of their neighbors. Their sketches were not heroic propaganda. They were clinical, devastating records of collapse. One artist, Vladimir Konashevich, focused on drawing detailed, beautiful illustrations for a children's book of fairy tales. He later said it was his way of defending a child's soul against the reality outside the page. These acts of protection of seeds for a world they would never see. The drawing of ruins, the clinging to fairy tales were forms of resistance as vital as holding a rifle. They were declarations that the human spirit could aim for something beyond mere biological persistence. But for every act of transcendent sacrifice, the pressure exposed a raw nerve of primal instinct. The black market evolved into a sophisticated, brutal shadow economy. The currency was bread. A Persian carpet could be had for 2 kilograms. A German shell case, turned into a stove, cost half a loaf. Criminal gangs, often with ties to corrupt officials, controlled certain distributions. The most disturbing black market operated in whispers. As starvation peaked in late 1941 and early 1942, the city recorded over 2,000 arrests for cannibalism. The NKVD files distinguish between corpse eating and murder for the purpose of cannibalism. The former was more common. The latter existed in the frozen, lightless apartments, where the social contract had dissolved into a fight for individual survival. The unthinkable became a documented, if rare, crime. Families barricaded their doors at night. The pressure did not create monsters. It removed, layer by layer, the civilized constraints that keep the monster in check. For the vast majority, the monster remained caged by conscience, religion, or sheer inertia. But its presence in the city, a secret history, proved the trap. Ultimate psychological victory. It forced people to confront the beast within themselves and their neighbors. De Sumarov, 1942, brought a different kind of terror. The Solyanoye-Gorodok fire. On a windy day in May, German incendiary bombs struck the city's massive food warehouses on the banks of the Neva. The buildings, known as the Haymarket, held thousands of tons of precious reserves, sugar, flour, vegetable oil. The fire raged 4 days. Citizens watched in helpless agony as the very symbol of their hoped-for salvation burned against the sky, a pillar of smoke that taunted them with the scent of caramelizing sugar. Firefighters, weakened by hunger, fought the blaze with pathetic desperation. Looters rushed into the inferno, stuffing scorched, molten sugar into their clothes, often burning themselves terribly. The fire consumed not just supplies, but a fragile, collective hope. It was a calculated act of economic warfare, a reminder from the German High Command that the siege was not a passive containment, but an active, tightening. The pressure was intelligent, adaptive, and cruel. Yet, within this same summer, came the most defiant gesture of all. On August 9th, 1942, in the Grand Hall of the Leningrad Philharmonic, the surviving members of the radio orchestra, supplemented by musicians pulled from the front lines, performed Dmitri Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, Leningrad. The composer had written the first movements in the city before his evacuation. The music was smuggled in on microfilm. The musicians rehearsed in unheated rooms, their fingers stiff with cold. One trombonist collapsed and died at a rehearsal. Another was brought to the concert on a sled. The hall was packed with the city's surviving intelligentsia, soldiers, and ordinary citizens who had queued for tickets with their bread rations. They wore their coats and felt boots inside. As the conductor, Karl Eliasberg, raised his baton, all the city's loudspeakers were switched on, and anti-aircraft batteries were ordered to silence any German plane that might disrupt the broadcast. The music began a deceptively simple, pastoral theme that is gradually invaded by a mechanical, relentless march of destruction. For the listeners, it was not a metaphor. It was documentary. It was the sound of their last 2 years. When the final, triumphant chords echoed and faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then, a storm of weeping and applause that lasted over an hour. The concert did not bring food. It did not lift the siege. But for those who heard it, live or over the crackling radio, it did something else. It gave the unspeakable experience a shape, a sound, a dignity. It told them their suffering had meaning beyond the statistics of calories and corpses. The pressure had not crushed their culture. It had distilled it into its most potent, essential form. The second winter, 1942 a 1943, was colder, but less deadly. The Ladoga ice road was better organized, now a proper road of life, with regulated truck convoys, repair stations, and anti-aircraft guns. More food got in. More people, especially children, were evacuated out. The death rate, while still horrific, dropped from thousands per day to hundreds. The trap's jaws were the same, but the body caught in them had grown tougher, more scarred, and more adept at finding the microscopic spaces to breathe. People had learned the rules of this new, awful world. They knew how to stretch a bread ration with hot water and salt to make a soup. They knew which weeds were edible. They knew the value of a pair of felt boots versus a gold watch. The community, shattered and rebuilt 100 times over, developed its own siege morality. Sharing with your immediate apartment commune was expected. Stealing from the shared kitchen was a crime, punishable by ostracism or worse. The pressure had forged a new, hardened social organism, one adapted explicitly for survival in hell. The breaking of the siege in January 1943 was not liberation. It was a crack. Operation Iskra Spark saw Soviet forces from inside Leningrad and from outside fight towards each other through a narrow, swampy corridor south of Lake Ladoga. After days of brutal fighting in the deep snow, the corridor was only 8 to 11 kilometers wide, under constant German artillery fire, but it was land. A single rail line was hastily built across it. Supplies could now come in by train, not just by precarious truck over ice. The first train brought not just food, but coal, and the city's first real electricity in over a year. When the lights flickered on in a few districts, people did not cheer. They stood and cried. The crack of light was psychological. It proved the outside world still existed and was fighting its way back to them. The geographical trap had been partially, tenuously, breached. But the city remained a front-line target. The shelling and bombing intensified in retaliation. Another 600,000 would die before the siege was fully lifted in January 1944. The pressure merely changed form again, from the slow squeeze of starvation to the violent hammer blows of a vengeful enemy. The final lifting of the siege on January 27, 1944, came with a 324-gun salute from the city itself. Crowds emerged into the streets. They were not the same people who had been trapped in 1941. They were older, harder, haunted. They embraced soldiers, strangers. They looked south, where the German lines were now crumbling. The silence that followed the last salvo was the most profound sound many had ever heard. It was the sound of the trap, finally, irrevocably, springing open. But stepping out of it was a new ordeal. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of ruin, over 1 million civilians dead. A city shredded by shells, pockmarked by craters, its buildings skeletal. But the physical rebuilding was the easy part. The psychological aftermath was the true, lasting siege. Survivors suffered from what would later be called post-traumatic stress, insomnia, anxiety, hypervigilance, and a relationship with food that was forever pathological. Hoarding bread became a lifelong habit. The sound of a distant plane could trigger a panic attack. They were citizens of a new country, the country of the sea gond. They would carry its passport for the rest of their lives. The legacy of the Leningrad trap is not just a historical lesson in resilience. It is a dark map of human limits. It asks the terrible question, how much pressure can a modern, civilized society endure before it breaks? The answer is complex. It broke in places morally, socially, individually. But it held in others, often in the most unexpected ways. In a seed vault, on a sheet of music, in the shared warmth of a Berzwika stove around which strangers huddled. The siege proved that the will to live is not always a beautiful thing. It can be ugly, selfish, and desperate. But it also proved that the will to *, mean asterisk something. To create, to protect an idea of the future, can persist even when the will to live is fading. The 3 million entered the trap as citizens of Leningrad. Those who emerged were something else, witnesses to the absolute extreme of the human condition. The trap measured them, and in doing so, it measured all of us. It showed what we are capable of losing. And, against all odds and reason, we are sometimes capable of saving, even if it's just a single scorched seed or a note of music in the frozen dark. The hope they had was not for rescue, but for meaning. And in that, against the arithmetic of starvation and the geometry of encirclement, they somehow, barely, found a way not to lose it completely. The war ended. The world moved on. But for Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, the siege never truly lifted. It transitioned from a present horror to a permanent, silent partner in the city's soul. The physical rebuilding was a Soviet triumph of propaganda and genuine will. The golden spire of the Admiralty was the shattered facades of the Hermitage were meticulously restored. The trenches and vegetable plots in the summer garden were replaced with returned statues and orderly flowers. By the 1950s, a visitor might see only a beautiful, slightly worn imperial capital. The scars were hidden beneath fresh plaster and paint, but the real damage was internal, woven into the nervous systems of the survivors, and etched into the very fabric of family memory. The survivors carried the siege within them like a second skeleton. It manifested in small, relentless ways. They saved every crust of bread, storing petrified pieces in cupboards for a famine that never came. They hoarded matches, soap, any commodity that had once been priceless. The smell of burning wood or the particular wail of a vintage air raid siren could trigger a physical reaction, a racing heart, cold sweats, a mute, frozen terror. They were marked by what doctors called dystrophy survivor syndrome. Weakened hearts, damaged organs, compromised immune systems from years of starvation. But the psychological wounds ran deeper. Many found they could not speak of it at all. The experience was a locked room inside them. Others talked of it constantly, in minute, obsessive detail, a weight of the daily bread ration on November 12, 1941, the specific sound of a particular shell. Their stories were not narratives with beginnings and ends, but sensory fragments, shards of a broken mirror that could never be real. The pressure had been so total, it had shattered the normal continuum of memory. The city itself became a vast, unmarked cemetery. Every courtyard, every street corner, every staircase held a ghost. A woman might point to a windowsill and say, "My father died there." A man might avoid a certain tram stop because that's where he last saw his sister, waiting in a line that stretched into oblivion. The official memorials are vast. Solemn Piskaryovskoe Cemetery with its eternal flame and heartbreaking epitaph. No one is forgotten. Nothing is forgotten. Were for the state and for visitors. The real memorials were these invisible, personal coordinates of loss, known only to the survivors. The communal apartments slowly emptied of those who remembered, and new families moved in, unaware that the room where their child slept was where an old man had quietly turned to face the wall and starved to death in February 1942. The past was buried in the walls, in the floorboards, in the city's very soil. The legacy of the trap is a lesson in the fragility of the systems we take for granted. Leningrad was not a primitive settlement. It was a modern, 20th-century metropolis with power grids, water mains, railways, and a complex bureaucratic government. The siege proved that all of this is a thin veneer. Strip away the fuel, the food supply, the electricity, and modernity collapses with shocking speed. What remains is the medieval city, a huddled mass of people dependent on bare logistics and raw human endurance. The siege was a brutal experiment that revealed the minimum requirements for a city to remain a city, and not just a dying herd. It showed that civilization is not monuments or institutions, but the continuous, fragile flow of energy and calories into a concentrated human space. Sever that flow, and the culture, the law, the very bonds of society begin to fray at the edges, then tear at the center. Yet, the legacy is also a terrifying study in adaptation. The human body and mind, when given no alternative, can adapt to previously unthinkable conditions. The metabolism can slow to a hibernative state. The mind can learn to compartmentalize horror, to focus on the next single, tiny task. Melting snow for water, trading a book for a handful of oats walking. 5 kilometers on frozen feet to report for a shift that might earn an extra 100 grams of bread. The Leningraders became experts in a new, awful science of survival under total constraint. They innovated with desperation, turning library paste into food, burning furniture not for warmth alone, but for the critical task of boiling water to ward off typhus. This adaptability is not a comforting thought. It is a dark reassurance of our species' durability. But it comes at a price measured in shattered souls and a million graves. For the Channel civilizations under pressure, Leningrad represents the ultimate case study. It is pressure in its most pure, relentless form. Geographic, economic, thermal, psychological, and moral. Every decision, from the command level down to the individual in a frozen apartment, was made under a weight that distorted all normal calculus. Do you share your last piece of bread with your child, ensuring they might live another day while you certainly die? Or do you eat it, maintaining your strength to possibly scavenge more for both of you later? There is no correct answer, only a choice made in the dark, with no right answer, only consequences. The siege removed the luxury of good options, leaving only less terrible ones. The final, lingering question of Leningrad is not, how did they survive? But, what does survival mean? For many, survival meant living with a void where their family had been, with the guilt that they had eaten when others had not, with memories that were a form of ongoing trauma. Their victory was not a return to normal life. That was impossible. Their victory was endurance itself. It was the fact that they, and their city, persisted. The German objective had been to erase Leningrad from the earth, to literally wipe it off the map. They failed. The city's continued existence, its rebuilt beauty, the footsteps of new generations on its old streets, that is the rebuttal. But to walk those streets today is to walk over a shadow city. It is the city of hunger, of the frozen sled, of the distant thump of the metronome on the radio. The pressure of those 872 days compressed time and experience into a diamond of unbearable hardness, and that diamond remains at the city's heart. It is a monument not to glory, but to loss. Not to the heroism of soldiers, though that existed, but to the quiet, terrible heroism of the civilian who, when faced with no escape and no hope, simply took the next breath, and then the next, and then the next, until the breath itself became an act of defiance. The trap showed them the very bottom of human existence, and they, from that bottom, with nothing left to lose but the spark of consciousness itself, proved that even there, in the frozen dark, the human spirit does not simply go out. It sometimes just burns lower, waiting for the wind to change.